Thank you. If everyone could please sit down. We're starting our next panel, moving on, I would say, seamlessly from finding out whether the EDTIB is ready for the capacity it needs for Europe, onto the NATO-EU partnership, of course, a key relationship in making Europe and the US, the NATO partners, fit for purpose in the current security environment. Joining me here to discuss this, the new chairman of the EU Military Committee, Lieutenant General Sean Clancy. Thank you for being with us. Cosmic Dobron, the Director for Peace Partnerships and Crisis Management at the EEAS. Marcus Perestrello, the President of NATO PA, NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and also a member of the Portuguese Parliament. And Wouter Beke, a member of the European Parliament, and he's a member of the Committees on Foreign Affairs, Security and Defense, Industry, Research and Energy, and on the Delegation for Relations with the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So basically, you could just sit here and we revolve all the panels for the rest of the day around you, because that's pretty much what we're talking about here. So, everyone knows, I'm Terry Schultz. I'm a holdover from the last panel. Okay, so in October, the then new Secretary General Mark Rutte and the renewed European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen declared their intention to deepen cooperation between NATO and the EU. Now, I've been in Brussels a long time, and they say this every time there's a new Secretary General and a new, head of the European Commission. So, are they really going to make this happen? Of course, the situation is drastically changed, the security situation for both NATO and the European Union since the last time this new partnership took over, with Jens Stoltenberg, of course, being there 10 years. But it seems that despite the highest of ambitions, often these projects fizzle out. There are currently 74 principles of cooperation signed way back in 2016, I think, between the EU and NATO. So we're not going to go through all of them on this panel, but certainly talk about some of the ones that are working and some of them that are not, and what needs to be the priority. And I'm going to start with General Clancy. So your job's tough, exciting, I think, opportunity to make a lot of difference as head of the EU Military Committee, and completely different sense of what an EU Military Committee is today. So many changes just in the term of your predecessor. So I'm going to start you off easy because I think your job's tough enough. So I'm going to let you just tell us what your priorities are. You've been in the job, what, a couple of months now?
I've been in the job a week.
A week? Oh, I thought, oh my gosh, so I overstated. All right, so really easy, all right.
Thank you very much. We'll appreciate that, Terry. And, thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's still morning, just about, I think. So I'm delighted to be here. And as Terry said, I'm just the incoming chair of the EU Military Committee. It's a great privilege and honour to be here this morning with you all. And thank you for the opening question, because undoubtedly, it is clear that everybody here is interested in defence and security in the broader context, but also in this narrow context that we're speaking with regards to the EU-NATO relationship today, which is important. I suppose I represent, if I can, for everybody here, the chair of the Military Committee. I represent the voice, if you like, of the 27 EU member state CHODs. So the collective voice of the chiefs of defence across Europe, which, as you can imagine, and I was listening to the end of your previous panel, and of course, having that voice heard at appropriate times and at the right time in a very dynamic environment is hugely important to us. And we are living, people use the word moment, we're living in a defining period for Europe. And I say period because it's not instant, it's moving on very, very quickly. We are very aware of the Russian aggression, we know about the instability to our south, and of course, the refocus, if you like, the geopolitical and geostrategic refocus of the US toward the Indo-Pacific are all factors that now influence the decision-making, the thought process, the ideas, the innovation that we have to come up with in our response. But clearly, for me, and taking over this role, I have a clear vision about EU being stronger. And I very simply and very simplistic on the principle that we are stronger through our unity and our credibility comes through our capability. And when you think about those words and how they permeate through all of the various tools, structures, and enablers that the EU brings to the table in an EU-NATO relationship, it's very, very important. So the EU has clearly to be more responsive. And to do that, I would suggest that it's no longer optional for strategic responsibility to be taken on board by the EU. It's actually imperative that we take it on at this time, for all of those reasons. And therefore, in looking at our EU-NATO relationship, we have to contribute constructively to that relationship because we work on the principle that the NATO is, in fact, our security guarantee, and we're not shying away from that principle. And we're working at that through the Military Committee, through our advices, in areas such as coordinated capability development, in our approach to joint exercises, scenario building, and of course, working also on reinforcing the principle that we have one single set of forces, irrespective of whether it's NATO vision, through the NATO lens or through the EU lens, and it's from that. So for me, what are the challenges? I think in one sense it's very simple. We must remove political obstruction. We must remove barriers to operations, such as information sharing. We must definitely create the conditions for more practical and deeper cooperation between the EU and NATO on a practical level. And we must remove any barriers that we see in terms of the operational side at the end, and the end state. And I think we can achieve this by some of the items that are clearly on your agenda today, by a very considered, robust investment strategy, by creating an industrial base that we can have confidence in terms of our supply chains, and that we are prepared and ready to act when the time comes to act. And the strength of all of this will come through alliances. Now, we have alliances with the UK, we have them with Canada, and we of course have them with the US, but the most important alliance of all is with our NATO. And through NATO, if we have a structured, transparent, and the principle of reciprocity in all of the enablers and the strength through that. And when we talk about complementarity, you cannot say that word without saying the lack of duplication. And we have to try and minimize duplication where it is not necessary. And for all of those reasons, I think the strength and partnerships through alliances and through what we're trying to discuss here today is going to be the key to our success, to make Europe stronger and by default, making NATO stronger.
And if I could just ask a really basic question that comes to my mind, under what circumstances would the EU Military Committee act separately from NATO? I mean, what would be your role in a crisis? What would be your role in conjunction with NATO's responsibilities? I think this is something that bedevils everybody when you think about this.
Sure, and I mean this, I've often equated the analogy of the EU Military Committee. It's like in 2001 when the EU Council decided through its decisions to stand up an EU Military Committee. It was like the organ transplant into the institutions of the EU. And we have been in the anti-transplant drug since, and we haven't got off it. But the reality is that the Military Committee brings what is the considered military advice, either anticipatory or after the development of actual policy. That's the first thing. But on a practical level, from the Military Committee and advice on operations, so the military staff within the institution take care of the operations. But in a crisis, in an existential crisis where the EU decides to act by itself, and that is what makes it unique from NATO in one sense. It has the capacity to act in common security and defence policy framework operations. And we see them in the Mediterranean, for instance, when we stood up very quickly as SPDIS. We have seen them in Africa, in the likes of Mozambique and other areas. Sahel, of course, was there, and we know what has transpired there. But there are many examples of where EU can act independently of NATO, and it's important that it's able to act, because its readiness and its ability to act is something that has to be grown, and this is what we have to strengthen within the EU, and it has to be done on a complementary basis to NATO, acknowledging that NATO is the primary guarantor of our security in the continent of the EU. That's important. But the EU's ability to act is equally as important. We have seen examples of that, and we'll see that continue into the future. And I can go on with many other examples. EUMAM is another case.
Yeah, it's certainly something that will be getting new attention, I would guess, with the uncertainty at NATO headquarters.
Correct. And the military expertise in terms of the standing up of those operations and how we exercise them. For example, any of those operations require resources. It's the military chiefs of defence ultimately are the conveyors of those resources. They are those that will be able to advise their national capitals. The national capitals are reliant in terms of their policy and their contribution, and therefore if we see the enactment of any of the TEU, for instance, in terms of 42.7, if that is called on enacted, what is the quantum of the various national contributions or responses to the exercise of 42.7? And other areas when crises do arise. So these are all the things that the CHODs advise on. The EU Military Committee here as an institution here within the EU brings that together. The paradox, of course, the paradox of the 42.7 is that whereby it's exercised through the TEU, but actually there's no coordinating piece in Europe at all. It's down to the national responses, either bilaterally or multilaterally, that respond to the actual call from a given nation, and it's that nation actually ends up setting out the stall bilaterally or multilaterally. It's not coordinated at an EU level, and that's the paradox of that particular clause.
Oh, that's true. That's different from Article 5, although countries in Article 5 also are allowed to decide in what way they respond.
Yeah, there's a subtle difference, of course, between Article 5 and 42.7. Very, very clear differences, but they can be exercised together or independently, and that's important.
Thank you. I mean, this is a good primer for me on EU Military Committee, since we pay so much more attention to European role in NATO. So way to say glad to have you here today, that's for sure. And Cosmin, moving on to you, I mean, one of the examples that we were going to take is where NATO and the EU have worked together extremely well, and that is to help Ukraine. It's been a high priority for both organizations and different roles, but what can you tell us about the intention to continue this support, again, perhaps looking at the dropping out of U.S. support?
Thank you very much for having me. If I may have a comment on the question
Absolutely.
that you posed to the chairman of the Military Committee, because this has been a good implant. And I'm saying this because basically the short answer is that the EU is now moving towards a stronger role in security and defense, and that means we need more military expertise in whatever we do. So that's the bottom line of it, and more often we go to the Military Committee to check ideas, but also to see if the posture that we like the EU to take basically is based on serious analysis when it comes to forces, when it comes to possibilities, and that's where the Military Committee intervenes, and we very much appreciate the cooperation with the Military Committee. And so it has been a very good implant from our perspective. Now, on your question on Ukraine, Ukraine basically is perhaps the best example of where EU and NATO increased cooperation in the last 3 years and so. You referred to 74 principles. We say that we have 7 common concrete projects that we constantly monitor in terms of involvement. We have 3 joint declarations since 2016, the Warsaw NATO Summit. But the backbone of the cooperation when it comes to NATO is the staff-to-staff cooperation, and this works extremely well. We have now 7 structured dialogues on different areas of interest for both the EU and NATO. So if you want, basically, when it comes to describing NATO from the EU perspective, is our closest strategic partner that we have. On Ukraine, we have worked a lot. Basically, we have UMAM, which is our military mission. We have trained more than 76,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Now we have SATU, which is being developed on the NATO side. And what we do, not only that we try to delineate the work so that we don't work on the same type of challenges, but we try to be complementary from the perspective that the work that we do can be used in the NATO context and the other way around.
We should describe what NSATU is. It's the new NATO, well, new-ish, late last year, organizational body for coordination of aid to Ukraine.
Exactly.
Yeah, not everybody knows that horrible acronym.
Yes, yes. It's about coordination, the support for Ukraine, the military support for Ukraine. For us, it's important because, for example, when it comes to training, we do training. Actually, member states provide training support to Ukraine.
And it's also useful because it took some of that responsibility out from under the United States unilaterally and made it part of NATO, which is probably easier for the European Union to integrate with.
We had excellent cooperation before with SAGU and all the meetings, the Rammstein format and all the discussions. There was a very good coordination, but the cooperation with NATO now is much more direct, obviously based on the needs which are spelled out by Ukraine. So this is the starting point for both the EU and NATO. We also resumed the famous PSC-NAC meetings recently, and it's not by coincidence that the first meeting was an informal meeting on support for Ukraine. So this is also a good start because, as you know, there was a bit of a gap in between these meetings. So we think that now the political level is catching up with the operational level. And this is also very telling because basically it shows that we are now entering a new phase when it comes to cooperation between the EU and NATO. And you will see more of that because basically the summits will have the NATO summit in Hague, we'll have the European summit in Brussels, which are a little bit back to back.
Very much back to back.
And what we are trying to do now is basically to align all the processes and decisions that are taking place in the EU context with those in NATO. When it comes, and obviously we have the discussion about the spending, the overall spending for defense. We are also trying to support with all the programs that we have discussed with colleagues from the European Commission to support EU member states that are members, that are allies of NATO to basically reach those targets that they have established. So you'll see more and more synergies between what we do at EU level and what is done in the NATO context. Now, I want to say, because obviously it's not all honey and milk, but I want to say that in terms of the staff cooperation, we have weekly meetings with NATO. We consult on all the operational details, be it on the NATO side or on the EU side. So from that perspective, everything works very well. Obviously, at the political level, there is another dynamic, and I think we should, perhaps is also what the chairman also referred to, that we need to bring more unity within EU, but also within NATO. I think this political element perhaps is where we have to insist more.
Absolutely true, because I've often heard that EU countries will share intelligence, for example, with the US, which they won't share with their neighboring EU country, and that's certainly a hindrance which needs to be worked on. But we can talk more about things like that, because I want to move on to Marcos. So NATO Parliamentary Assembly has already had its summit. You just came back from Ohio.
We have two summits each year.
Yeah. So how did this one go? I mean, any sort of foretelling of how The Hague will go? Because you do have U.S. lawmakers, and I am going to put the sort of transatlantic question on you at the moment, because your organization, it does very well comprise the European and U.S. lawmakers.
Well, we do two summits every year.
Okay.
One in
You've
spring,
just had one.
Another in autumn, and we just had one in spring, the spring session in Dayton, in the U.S. A few weeks ago. I would say that if you look at the transatlantic relation, you can say that it has been quite demanding in the last months, and it has been demanding in several fields. And if you look at the political field, both in the multilateral relation and the ally-to-ally bilateral relation, if you look at the economic, if you think of the economic relation on the field of economics, and if you look at the strategic dynamic, and specifically on the NATO issue, I think we are allowed to say that the most consistent is the strategic one regarding NATO. Much more consistent relation than the two other examples. So we should.
This is what is said at NATO headquarters. There's no question of immediate pullout, no question of changing the nuclear relationship.
You have as I said, you have a very demanding, increasing demanding relation on the transatlantic relation, and on the different aspects of that relation, I consider that the most consistent is the one on strategic issues and NATO. And we should have that in mind when we hear a lot of things about this relation. At the end, what the US is asking, not for 1 year, but for several years, is that Europe and Canada do more for their own defense. And at the end, we also agree on that. Europeans and Canadians agree on that. And that's a very positive aspect that we should bear in mind when we think on this big alliance that we are in. That was the result of our summits, as you call it, in Dayton, and that was clear for us. We had the Undersecretary Landau and the new U.S. ambassador in NATO, except that made very clear speeches about how they see the relation of U.S. and Europe in the future. And that is based on the same idea that we have, that we agree, and also the European Union agree, that we need to do a lot more. And that's why it's the new capability targets agreed by the heads of states and governments on the past weeks. It's very relevant. That's why the SecGen of NATO can now talk about huge percentage of GDP spending on defense. And that's why all the countries, after all, are committed this year to reach 2%. And that will be a huge achievement of the Hague Summit. The strong commitment of all the countries of
to
NATO
2%?
to 2%. They will commit with that. I think one of the countries will commit only next year, but the others, I believe, they will commit with 2% this year. I don't know exactly how.
They're going to have to go to 5.
I'm seeing it from the parliamentarian view. I don't know exactly how they will reach to 2%, the ones that are not there. And the rest, it will be settled on the Hague, and that's the high expectation that we have for that. But what I would say that about the transatlantic relation is that on the strategic field, regardless the differences of tone, the differences of approach, the differences of policies, the differences on the way how some strategic values and foundational values that are still common to both sides of the Atlantic are seen by the new US administration, and the impact of this change of view on those strategic values can have on the relation between allies. The main objective, both from the US, Canada, and the European allies, is still the same: to make a stronger NATO, a stronger alliance, on the belief that without strong capabilities, there's no strong deterrence, no strong defense. And that common view needs to be underlined and not undermined, as many times we see on the public space.
Well, that's meant to be reassuring, sure, but I want to bring in Wouter here. It still is discouraging, I would think. I mean, when you do have continual lambasting about the European Union from the White House, and this is continuous. And I saw a panel 2-3 weeks ago with the U.S. ambassador to NATO. It was public, so I can say it. And the Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski said, you should really appreciate the EU because it's giving us the means to pay for these new, to make ourselves more militarily strong, to pay for the things that you want us to have. And Ambassador Whitaker said, I'm not buying it, nope. So, I mean, this kind of animosity towards the EU, how much do you see that affecting the cooperation? Because yeah, I expect you're going to be hearing a lot more about that. It's 3.5 years to go, at least.
Well, I think that when we talk between the United States and countries of the European Union, there is some constructive ambiguity. Let us speak openly, because, and also in Dayton, of course, we all want a stronger NATO and so on and so on. But you have also to answer on the critical questions. What does it mean exactly? Is there a backstop if necessary? Yes or no? What does it mean in our alliance towards the Ukraine army right at the moment? The Ukraine army right at the moment is the European army. We are funding the Ukraine army. They are not only fighting for their territory, they are also fighting for our liberty towards Russian aggression. And so we need to know what do we have towards each other. And if this is not, if this does not give clear answers, then the only solution for Europe and European countries is to work closely, more closely together. And like mentioned earlier, we have not only Article 5, but we have also Article 42. But we don't have the instruments in Europe to implement Article 42.
Thank God no one's tried it yet.
And so that is what we have to work on. And all the initiatives now taken by the European Commission, the SAFE program, IDIP, and so on, is coming to create a stronger European defense union, not against the NATO, but we are doing this in the perspective that we are not sure anymore that we can count on our American ally. That's the truth. That's the truth. Yep. And so that is what we have to do. That is what is on the agenda.
So the NATO-EU partnership, you're saying, means the EU being stronger, and that there's just, I mean, that's what's being discussed, that's what the US demanded, and that's what these efforts are trying to do. So what is the partnership then? The partnership is do you think, permanently redefined?
Well, I don't think that the United States will blow up this partnership. But the question is, how much are they involved into this partnership? That is the question.
Yeah, what does their side bring, you're saying?
Yeah, and
yeah.
I think that we have to take as a basic hypothesis that we have to do it by ourselves. And also when we are discussing about the 5% or the issues like this and what stuff do we need in Europe, it is it's reasoned about this point of view, that we have to be ready for ourselves.
Because you just can't know. You just
Yes.
can't know.
Yes.
General Clancy, does it make you feel reassured if, as expected, there's a 5% pledge of 3.5% GDP, 1.5% kind of whatever? No, I'm just kidding. Military mobility and other things. Does that make you feel like you have stronger EU militaries? Or do you fear that this might just be on paper, pressure to come up with something for the summit, and that countries still, Spain, other countries still don't have the capacity to either spend 3.5% or more, and it's just a promise on paper?
There's an awful lot in that, Terry.
Yeah, I know, I'm sorry.
Okay. And, but it's genuine because it's the same thread, and I will come back to it because Booker has a very important point made there around the, about the US and the context of the US, and what I referred to earlier about deepening political engagement and removing obstacles. We're looking at this, we're in reactive mode. Everybody's in reactive mode, right through from the political down to the tactical right now in terms of a response. But overall, what we're seeing is a rebalancing actually on the geopolitical, geostrategic level. And we need to look at it through that lens, not through the lens of a response to the US per se. And because we haven't even defined what the transition looks like and where we're going to find that balance And we're looking at perhaps through the forces, and we're looking at it through the security lens, but it's far greater than that. And until we find that our way and a roadmap through transition, we're going to come out the other end. And that's when the questions around how we view the other areas on the globe. So it's a global reset in one sense.
What do you mean, transition to what? Sorry to interrupt, but
transition
to
from what the
whatever
US,
it's going to be.
whatever the US participation in NATO looks like.
Because we don't know.
Because we don't know. Because what we have an assurance on, and what I think we can confidently say, is that the US is not going to abandon its relationships. It's not going to abandon its positions. And I mean, what was inferred in one of the comments was around industry, you know. And when we look at holistic dependency on the US and vice versa in terms of military capability alone, you know, that is a very deep, deep piece of work that needs to be figured out in terms of that space. How the EU is going to respond in terms of trade, in terms of all of the interconnectivity that exists in industry, and then ultimately how dependent we are on the US in terms of military supply right now. And that's the rebalance, and that's where the robust investments and the clever investments and how we rebalance industry is just one part of it. So what gives me confidence, you know, figures are being pushed up. One would argue that 2% is now surpassed, and we're going to 5, the 3.5, 1.5, which I think is a good approach that's being laid out. Each capital is going to have to decide how they respond to that within it. But ultimately, it's the capability that it's going to deliver, and how we prioritize that, and we have indicators in the white paper in terms of the 7 priorities that are laid down in terms of Readiness 2030. We have the EU Council decisions in March reinforcing that, but these priorities go much deeper and much wider. And you asked me about where the military committee comes in. You know, when we see these 7 priorities, then the Chads say, well, actually, we need to broaden these, and we have taken steps to try and do that. It has to be much broader and much deeper than just these 7 priorities, and I think that's acknowledged, because Ukraine, of course, is seen as a catalyzation of all of this, but the US focus and the totality of the holistic piece is really, because at the end of the day, we have to have confidence in Europe and member states being able to national territory defense and ultimately collective defense and security. So it is all interconnected. Does it give me confidence? Yes. Why? Because clearly, as one of your previous panels said, 2030, Readiness 2030 is there for a reason. That is actually a ceiling, not a target, I would suggest. And therefore, we have to accelerate our responses, and all of this interconnectivity in terms of all of these pieces I've put on the table, these are all ultimately have to be brought together by the instruments and the power that the EU has to enable member states to respond to demand for 5%, which ultimately makes the EU stronger, but makes NATO stronger. And it is about rebalancing, therefore, the transatlantic and the global strategic positioning as much as it is about the US.
But as I so often am when discussing these things, I'm always struck by the fact that we're talking about response to the US. We haven't even talked about Russia.
Well, we haven't, and that's my point. We're looking at it through, and that's because our initial instinct here at the moment is this response, is looking at that lens. But it's far broader than that, and I think we should look at it more in a global strategic rebalancing, and that brings Russia, brings China, because we see the US focusing towards Indo-Pacific. We see Russia and what their intent is, and it's very hard to determine that in terms of the medium to longer term. I think we all have a sense of what that is, and that's why we're responding and reacting so as we are, and rightly so. But we have to get beyond, because now is the time for preparedness. Now is the time to actually prepare, because when we activate the response, that's not the time.
That's true.
That's
And the
too
German
late.
Chad has cut a year off of that, by the way. Now they say
Correct.
4 years, 3 to
Correct.
4 years. So.
Yes, and that is all based on the intelligence work and the analytical teams that are looking at this, and they're looking for the indicators right across the security and defense environment. And that's why President von der Leyen, the HRVP, Commissioner Kubilius, everybody's clear where the #1 priority lies right now for Europe, and that's in security and defense.
And I just thought of a possible silver lining of this stress and even of the push to get to the 5%. With the 1.5% that countries would be allowed to now includes spending on military mobility, for example, upgrading cyber networks. These are some of the priorities of this NATO-EU partnership and collaboration. So is it possible that now they'll be desperately looking for spending, to either increase their spending on these items that might have been pushed to the side before, with having to really build up just the military budget? Do you think this could be sort of a boon for things like the long-forgotten, one of my favorite subjects, military mobility?
Well, it depends on the geography, because if you are closer to Ukraine, then the danger that populations feel is much more present than in the west, in the north, or in the south. So if you go and talk to the people of middle city in Ukraine, or in Poland, or in Romania, where there were drones falling from the sky, yeah, you will get a completely different picture compared to asking somebody in the west. There is already on the defense industry level, there is already a lot of discussions about the kind of equipment that is needed. I mean,
but that's in the military budget. In the 1.5%, it would be these other things that are not normally included in military spending. So
but it's linked. It's all linked, because in the end, for each member state, there is one budget, and you have to arbitrate. If you're a prime minister or if you're a president, and you have to basically divide the budget, you need to arbitrate among these. There is no separate discussion on defense or separate discussion on non-defense items. And I think that's where we sometimes underestimate the complexity of the issue. I'm not sure that the populations in the 27 member states have a clear understanding of the threat, the nature of the threat, and on the need to do something now to be prepared. That's for me, this is the most difficult issue, because if you look at the fragmentation of politics in Europe, it's quite dangerous. And now with FIMI, with this information, it's very easy to basically have two competing points of views based on basically non-reality. That's True. What it is. But I think that we have in the white paper, we have the priorities in terms of capabilities, in terms of gaps. I think air defense perhaps it would be one of the number one, number two, number three
exactly.
type of priorities, if you ask me. But then how we get there and how the money is going to be spent, that's a completely different discussion. But for me, this perhaps would be the sort of what we'll be busy with in the next years.
Yesterday, Mark Rutte speaking at Chatham House, everybody knows I listened to that speech now, he said you need a 400% increase in air and missile defense. So those are some pretty big numbers. I wanted to ask you, Marco, because I'm also speaking to your Portuguese roots. You're a member of Portuguese Parliament, not a big spender when it comes to NATO targets. Lousy spender, we could even say. I would just say not big. You, again, sort of scanning the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, where you hear views from the states that are on the front line, the states that do feel the same threat, the Russian. threat and those that don't.
You cannot threat at the public opinion. If you look at the polls, you will find out that the Portuguese people is one of the most supportive of Ukraine.
Okay.
As long, in spite of being the most distant capital from Kiev, but they are since the beginning of the war quite supportive. So I dispute that.
No, but they don't elect people who want to spend money on defense.
They elect because that's why I'm saying that you cannot blame on parliaments on that. There has been governmental options from several governments, but if you hear the parliamentarians on different parties, they are all committed with the need to increase the defense spending. So I dispute that.
Okay,
that said,
but
but
then I don't know just quickly then what's the problem?
The problem is governmental options, but not parliamentarian options, governmental options. Because on the parliamentarian field, you can feel that sense of urgency and the support to increase. And when the Portuguese government commits this year to reach 2%, anticipating the goal for 2029, the government will find parliamentarian support for it. I have no doubt about it on all the major parties. There has been only governmental decisions based on their own options and not lack of parliamentarian support for that.
Wouter, what would you say about the disconnect? And I think that that's part of the problem that we have.
Well, I want to add some elements. First, when I talk with my colleagues of the Mediterranean countries, then they say, we understand that we have to be that there has to be solidarity because of security reasons. But when we had problems with our migrants and the European Union asked solidarity to solve the migration problems and asylum problems, then the Eastern countries said, that's a problem at your borders, not at our borders. So solve your own problems.
So you think that bleeds over into this issue?
Why I saying this?
That's not a good word.
Because we can only solve this kind of problems at the European level. And one of the biggest issues and one of the biggest threats is the upcoming extreme right in the different countries, because they want a stronger security at the national level, not at the European level. But we can only solve this kind of problems at the European level. And when we want to solve this kind of problems, and when we really want to have a strong European defense union, then it's about not only about capabilities, it's also about the finance. And now the SAFE instrument was an important step, it was a first step, but it has to be the last step. It's about operabilities also. It's about the resources. It's about capabilities, and it's about a European approach. That's what I call the 4 elements or the force elements that we need to use for a European approach. And this European approach can only be the real answer to the security threats. I think that from the east to the south, the west or the north, they all feel right at the moment the security threats. When you look to the opinion polls, all the people feel it. And they also feel that we need a European approach to give this kind of answers. And that is what we have to do. If we don't do that, then I think that the combination of a rearming of European member states and the upcoming extreme right is a very threat for our democracy, our stability, and our peace within Europe. That is what we had. That is what we have had in 1914. That is what we have had in 1940. And that is what can come back if we don't give a European approach toward this challenge.
That's certainly a warning that we've been hearing. I only have 50 seconds left, unfortunately, so I'm going to put my panelists on the spot and say, if you had one priority, and I know that's impossible, but what is your top priority to improve NATO-EU cooperation right now at a time when it's desperately needed because of the threat from Russia, because of the need for Ukraine to win in order to continue protecting Europe? What would be, especially General Classy, what would be your number one? You've got, I mean, when you go back to work, your week 2 of work, what should be done first? Quick answers, everybody. Sorry.
Structured, it has to be very structured, it has to be transparent, and there has to be reciprocity.
Between NATO and the EU?
Absolutely, but I think the strength is in the partnership. and we're mutually dependent on one another.
And it sounds like it's getting better. Cosmin, what's the number one priority?
Reciprocity, definitely, and second, exchange of classified information.
Between member states or between NATO states?
Between NATO and EU, I would really
Really?
like to
Okay.
see that. Yeah.
All right, and that, but I've heard that that's getting better, yes?
Yes, it's getting better, but
long way to go.
different levels.
Okay, interesting, very interesting.
I'm not sure if it's the number one, but it's one we didn't spoke about it. It's the development of partnerships and networks of friends around the world, developing trade agreements, for instance, with South America, Mercosur agreement.
So you're talking on the EU side because NATO doesn't have trade agreements?
No, yes, yes. But
Okay.
that's something that the EU can do to help. And for instance, the trade agreement with India, the development of new partnerships, the development of networks, it's something that the EU can make, NATO cannot, and that it will be very relevant to develop the industry capabilities on defense too.
And global security as well.
And NATO
Stabilizing.
and NATO can then create also partnerships on
And it does.
several
Think about the
areas.
Indo-Pacific Four being invited to the last
Exactly that.
two summits. Yep. And Valtteri, last word?
Well, I already talked about the forces. This means strengthening the finance, the operabilities, the resources, the capabilities, and doing it together on the European way and at the European level. And one issue that we spoke here right this moment, but is of big importance, it's bringing the French nuclear capacity under a European umbrella. I think this is a quite important
That's a whole
thing
panel.
for
That's
the
a
European.
You throw that in right at the end, as if we could talk about it. And everybody wants to go to lunch. So thank you very much. This was fascinating. Really, thank you to all of you. It's one of my favorite topics, as you can tell, and I really appreciate the insights. And good luck, General Clancy. Great to have you here right at the beginning. For everyone else, it's lunchtime, and please be back here at 2 o'clock. Thank you. That was fun.